Charlie and Hadley, Chapter 5 is titled Mr. Bass at Last. It was a glorious morning when Chuck and David set out for Mr. Bass's, guiding their spaceship between them on its four-wheeled carrier, David in front and Chuck behind. The sun danced on the waters of Monterey Bay so brightly it hurt one's eyes to look. The seagulls on the shore were already getting their breakfasts, and everything was bright green and blue and white. Green gardens, blue bay, and white gulls and fishing boats. As for the spaceship, it was truly awe-inspiring. It was long and smooth and cigar-shaped, just as David had planned it, with the big window in front made of fine, thick plastiglass which David's mother had given them. On the right side was the door, which could be bolted tight shut when you got inside. At the rear was the sturdy, four-bladed tail, level on the end so that the spaceship could be upended to stand firmly. For the ship was separate from the carrier and could quite easily be slipped off when the time came to blast away. Over its entire surface it was covered with cleverly fitted sections of metal sheeting, so that it glistened and gleamed in the morning sun like some marvelous silvery fish. How beautiful it is! David said to himself as he stared at it, he hadn't realized before just how beautiful and how big. Now you know that was a funny thing. David turned around, and as they went along, he gave the spaceship another good look just to be sure about its size, and there was Chuck having a stare at it at the same time. "Chuck," said David, "does it seem bigger to you? That is, sort of bigger than it was last night?" "How could it be?" said Chuck scornfully, but he didn't sound at all sure of himself. "Well, it couldn't be, really," returned David hastily. "But all the same, it seems to me that it does." Chuck didn't answer. He just kept walking along with his eyebrows drawn up in a puzzled frown, and every now and then he'd give that spaceship a sidelong, wondering glance. He couldn't understand it. He thought they'd planned to have the ship 8 feet long, but surely it was longer than that now. How everyone gawked at them. Boys on bikes and workmen hurrying along, and women going up the street with bags of groceries in their arms. They'd look. Then they seemed to come to and look again, blinking and craning their necks as long as the big spaceship stayed in sight. What fun it was to knock the grown-ups off their pins like that. Meanwhile, they were coming nearer and nearer to the short street, 6 blocks from David's house, which his father had said would be Thallow Street. And they were so excited by this time that they forgot to wonder any more about the size of the spaceship. "Is it pretty soon now, Dave?" asked Chuck, and he sounded just a little bit scared. "Next block, Chuck. Funny, isn't it? No other fellows are bringing their spaceships. Somebody must have seen that notice besides me." "I still think it could be a big, awful kind of joke on us," said Chuck in his solid, fateful way. "I told you we should have hunted up the street first and talked to this Bass person." "You never did say anything about talking to him," said David angrily, and he knew he was angry because he was worried. So now they came to the end of the 6th block, and there, sure enough, was Thallow Street, a little, short, dead-end street, but plain as plain could be. They turned along it. All was perfectly quiet. Not another boy did they see. Not a person did they meet. "There, number 5, whispered Chuck, and they both stopped. It was the last house, tucked away in a mass of trees. Though the thick greenery could just make it out, very small, almost circular it seemed to be, with a roof somewhat the shape of a mushroom, and a strange sort of ridge running over the top. Tacked to the white picket fence was a sign printed in queer, straggling letters. They bent down to read, and it said, 5 Thallow Street. All spaceships welcome. Then, so unexpectedly that they jumped, there came a soft, high, delicate voice. "Why, come in, boys, come in." And the voice seemed so distant, as if a wind from a far place had carried it to them, that they could scarcely believe their eyes when a little old man poked his head out of the bushes right where they stood, a little old man not an inch taller than they were. "Come in, do," he urged, waving them eagerly forward. But at the time his glance lit up on the ship. "Oh," he cried, an amazed smile broke over his small, wizened face, and now he hopped right out of the bushes and whipped open the front gate. Oh, my," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with pleasure. "What a surprise! What a beautiful piece of work! Beautiful! Just beautiful!" He rubbed his palms gleefully together, and then was suddenly right beside them, devouring the spaceship with his great, round, pale brown eyes. "Oh, I never in the world expected anything like this. It's far beyond my wildest dreams." He smoothed a long, thin, web-like hand over the ship's glossy surface, leaned down and peered within, fetched a long breath, went around to the other side, peered some more, then drew a deep, satisfied sigh. "Goodness," he went on, as he said to himself, "just imagine. The boys of today, mere nippers too, simply to think of it. All so quick, practically in the blink of an eye. Marvelous, but now we must introduce ourselves. I, as you must have perhaps guessed, am Tycho Bass." He gave a quaint, formal little bow and held out his hand to each of them. "How do you do, Mr. Bass?" returned Chuck and David in chorus, and then, "I'm Chuck Masterson," said Chuck, his heart beating fast. "And I'm David Topman," said David, and thought how like a wisp of cool air was Mr. Bass's hand. "Which of you was it who saw my notice?" "My father showed it to me," said David, "and I cut it out and kept it, and I drew my plans that night." "So I thought it would be," murmured Mr. Bass, and he looked on David with the greatest affection. "So I thought it would be. You know, David, it must have been your father who came by last night just to be certain his son was not being fooled. I should so much have liked to talk to him about you, but I'm afraid I've shoved my window up too suddenly, for he vanished before I could do so much as call out to him. A great pity, but now we must go in and begin our planning at once, for there isn't a moment to lose. Not a moment." And that ends chapter 5.